Okay, so in this lesson, what I want to do is just basically have one unified location where we can all just sort of refer back to when we want to reference how we can get things into and out of Cinema 4D into Houdini and out of Houdini and back into Cinema 4D. A lot of this will be kind of applicable to other programs, I'm sure, as most of the workflows entail using Alembics, VDBs, and Redshift proxies. So choosing Redshift proxy as my sort of renderer of choice, I think that it works really well when trying to get files to translate between Houdini and Cinema 4D or any other application for certain instances. So while we're going to actually cover a whole bunch of this stuff in the lessons to come, I just wanted to sort of have one location where if you're getting lost and you're working on your own and you kind of wanted to have just a little bit of a refresher about how to get in and out of Houdini, I wanted to sort of have that made available for you in just one easy to locate spot. But we will be kind of doing some of this stuff as the rest of the course goes on. I just didn't want you to have to dig through lessons to try and find these specific workflows. So I'm just going to kind of lay out sort of a generic scenario here where we round trip out of Cinema using this animation. We have basically what is a golf club coming through, and you can see that the golf club swinging through and it's going to be hitting this ball, and you can see this tee. I've just animated the tee kind of flying off in slow motion, bouncing off the ground here. But really what we've been tasked with is we want to hit the golf ball with the golf club, and the golf ball is going to shatter apart into billions of pieces or whatever it is. So we've done everything we need to do so far in terms of animation over here, or we've received this file from another artist, and our job is just to take this golf ball to the next level in terms of its destruction. So generally speaking, the way we get things out of Cinema is by exporting an Alembic. And then the way we get things back into Cinema, I consider there to be three main categories of types of geometry that we can bring back in. The first type is Alembic geometry, or just geometry in general. If I wanted to export, sort of a liquid simulation, and I've got a fluid surface that I want to export, I would do an Alembic. If I wanted to export a rigid body destruction simulation and I have a bunch of pieces of geometry flying around, I would export an Alembic file. So that really geometry in a general sense is like really the first element. The second element is what I consider to be like volumes or VDBs. Anything that has to do with smoke, fire, anything like clouds or any sort of volumetric density that you would want to carry out of Houdini and into Cinema. That's sort of like the second element. So we've got geometry, solid geometry, and then we've got volumetric geometry, and then the third type is particle geometry, which really are like little dust particles, any types of particle geometry that's simply just represented as points. And the main file format for carrying that over is a Redshift proxy. It can also be done using an Alembic, but I find that to be super limited when you're bringing Alembic particles from Houdini into Cinema 4D. I don't know if it's, I think that in general there's a particle limit in Cinema 4D that is a little bit lower than what it is in Houdini. And by bypassing that limitation, by using a Redshift proxy, we can actually get tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of particles out of Houdini and into Cinema 4D. So enough about that. Let's just get going here. We've got this golf swing where our camera is moving and we're kind of tracking along, and this tee is being hit. This golf ball is going to be shattered. So let's get this geometry out of Cinema and into Houdini. So I'm just gonna go over here and let's see. I'm gonna want to bring everything over. I think in most cases, if the scene's pretty heavy, I would pick and choose and select. If I only needed these three items, I would just select those. But in general, we're gonna want everything. We're gonna want our camera for reference, just to make sure that our bounding, boxes are okay and everything. And so we'll just grab everything and hit File, Export Selected Object as Alembic. And then you get this window opened up here. You can see I've already saved my file in this lesson 6 folder, and I've got a Houdini file right here waiting for me to go. But I'll just make a new folder for my exports called ABC. I'm going to call it C4D ABC export, because we're going to also be exporting ABCs from Houdini, and I want to keep them separated so I don't get confused as to where these alembics came from. So also, before I dive into this folder, I'm just going to click on this file name of the project that we're in, just so that I get this string copied into my file path. I'm going to dive in here and just rename the extension back to ABC, and I'll click save. And then you get your Alembic export options. I usually just check a couple things here, make sure that my start frame 0, my end frame, I'll just drag that so that I get the full animation range here. It's also really important to note what frame rate you're working at. This project is 24 frames per second, and I'd like to keep all my projects at 24 frames per second if I can, because Houdini's default's 24 frames per second, and in the end you're rendering 6 less frames, so it makes your life just that much easier. And nobody else really notices the difference. I personally think 24 frames a second looks awesome. So after that, after I get all that kind of set up, we'll export this, and then I'm going to make sure this box is ticked selection only. That basically means that it's only going to export the objects I've selected in my scene. And then I want to also tick global coordinates. I've found that sometimes not having global coordinates checked can do some weird things. Now, this section right here where it talks about scene scale being in terms of centimeters, I like to leave everything the way it is, and this might be left over from my Maya days, but essentially I always heard that if you mess with the scene scale, it kind of messes up your project, or it can have unexpected things. So I generally tend to just leave this the way it is and handle all of the scaling manually. So you'll see what I mean in a minute, but in general, all of these settings are pretty much ready to go. I'm going to hit OK. A little progress bar will pop up. Apparently it was super lightweight, so it didn't need to take that long. I'll just hop over here to my lesson folder, and you can see my ABC export folders been created, and I've got my lesson 6 golf swing 01.abc. So I can now bring this into Houdini. So let's do that. I'm just going to switch over here. I've got my Houdini project. It's blank. And I'm just going to throw down a geometry node. So the way I like to bring in just about any type of file is I'll hop into a geometry node. I'll name it something like Alembic import. And I'll just jump in here and I'll throw down an Alembic file. ALEM. Yeah, there we go. So this Alembic file will allow me to point to a directory on disk, and here I can just, you can see it's going to I got my C4D ABC export folder, and I'm just going to select that, and it's bringing in my geometry. Great. So now that, and you can see that there's a little bit of a weirdness here. It's not pulled this sphere in at the correct location, but in a second, I'm going to actually unpack this. So if I hit convert, because this is packed up in a very efficient type of geometry that like loads faster, sometimes there can be some glitches, but in order to actually do anything useful with this geometry, it's got to be converted from that format into actual polygons that Houdini can understand. So I'm just going to wire this in, and when I click convert, you can see that I actually get polylines back, and everything is just sort of the way it was. And if I play this, you can see my club comes through, and it does the animation accordingly. One thing to note, though, is that now our golf ball is massive and our scene is massive in general. So I find that for most simulations, it is because Houdini is actually in units of meters instead of centimeters, everything that you bring from Cinema into Houdini is going to be 100 times larger than it needs to be. So the first thing you could do is throw down a transform, and then transform this down uniformly by 0.01. And now we're dealing with actual sizes. So this is really where the relationship becomes 1-to-1. Not to confuse matters, I personally, when I'm working with simulations, I actually find them to be much easier to do when they're on a level that is more in the range of like around 1 meter. So now, because this is so tiny, usually what I'll do is I'll actually blow it up a little bit. So generally speaking, I'll be mostly I do simulations that are, you know, kind of in the range of 1 to 10 meters. And this is so small that I find that defaults just tend not to load exactly correctly, and I get a little bit kind of glitchy behavior. So in this particular instance, I'm just going to scale this down to a tenth of the size instead. So now our ball is a little bit larger. It's like, you know, it's not a meter wide, but it's just a little bit larger, and it'll make it easier to deal with, because really the way that this smashing simulation is going to occur, I really kind of want it to feel like it's almost like it's gigantic ball being destroyed anyways. So I found that bringing it up got me closer to the look that I was going for quicker. So just a simple thing with that. So now that we have this this geometry, I'm just going to go back and highlight the transform here. And you can see that if I just hit W to turn wireframe mode back off, even now somehow this alembic has corrected itself. That's totally normal. It just has some weird glitchy behavior sometimes. But now it looks like everything's working fine. But if you notice, it's just one piece of geometry. We really kind of need to take it upon ourselves to break this off into its separate components, because I don't want to sim everything. I just want to sim this golf ball. So let's actually do what we can to split apart the tee, the golf ball, and the golf club. So I'm going to just go to a frame where they're all in view here. And I'll just start first with the golf ball. So the way I like to do that when I'm dealing with Alembic files is I'll go to my selection tool here, and you can see that when I hover over, it's selecting all these pieces of geometry. And then if I want to isolate something into its own stream, I can hit the delete key. And you can see it throws down a blast node over here, and it's set the group to 0. That means that primitive 0 is being deleted. Again, I'm doing this before I do any conversion, because this won't actually convert to be the same thing after the fact. So I'm doing this before conversion, but primitive 0 I find is pretty nondescript. If I were to add geo in Cinema and then re-import more geo, it wouldn't retain this this group number 0 likely. So it's not the best way to actually isolate your geo. I find that what I could do is actually select an alembic path. So just to make a point clearer here, again, when I'm deleting geometry to isolate it, I want to do delete non-selected. So here we've isolated our ball. Our ball is isolated now because it is just grabbing group 0 and deleting everything but group 0. So I find that what's better is, let's go back, and I'm going to use my selection tool again, but up here where it says select, there is an alembic paths filter you can throw down. So when I click this, you can see that I actually get a hierarchy over here, which is pretty descriptive. It's basically the hierarchy we had in Cinema that we exported. So if I now go click to the ball and then hit the delete key, you can see here, I don't need this old blast node. This is the new blast node that was created. And it actually, inside the group field, has listed out our path for us, which actually is very descriptive. As long as our directories don't change when we re-import, it should be able to grab this, this path again, because it's actually being very explicit as to what it's grabbing from the alembic file and not just listing off a bunch of primitives in order. So now that I've got this, this ball, I'm just going to bring this off to the side here. I don't really need this other blast. I'll just delete that. And then I will go over here on this blast that has the path and then say delete non-selected. And here we have our ball. And you can see that it's moved back to the origin again. If I scrub the timeline, nothing really happens. If I hit convert, it pops into the position that it's supposed to be in. And now we have geometry that we are ready to fracture and use to drive the other parts of our simulation. So now that that is there, what I might do is throw down a null so I could easily reference it from another section of Houdini. And I'll just call it something descriptive like ball. So there we have it. And if I middle mouse click on this, you can see that it's brought over the normal and UV attributes that we had from Cinema. That's great. So next thing I want to do is let's just grab the let's grab this T, because we might have some particles flying around, and maybe this T, actually the ball needs to rest on top of this T as a collider before the actual club hits it. So let's just make this T its own thing. So I'll go back up here instead of being on the ball down here simply because I can't select anything. The ball is isolated. This is the ball stream over here. I'm going to go back up to the transform and create another stream by using my select tool, making sure I've got select alembic paths. And then I could even go over here and select my T from this list. Then I'll just go with my mouse hovering over the viewport, hit delete again. It inserts a blast in line with this other blast. Now that's not something that I want because that'll create kind of unexpected results over here. Now we don't have everything we need to have. So what I'll do is I'll actually shake this off so it becomes its own node, and then I'll rewire it back in. Then I'll just go and click delete non-selected, and now we have a T. The T is its own stream. So we've got our ball over here, we've got our T over here, and we're good. So now what I might do is, looks like I'm going to convert this one as well because I want it to be actual geo. So we throw down another convert. And I can tell right now that this purple color, their blue color, means that this T is actually reversed. It's inside out. So I'll throw down a reverse. It's just it's just a visual clue to help you know that your polygons are facing basically the wrong direction. So I'm going to reverse that, and then you can see that also it's super dark. That means that the normals got messed up as well. So I'll just throw down a normal and wire that guy in there, and everything should be good. Now it looks like the right side out geo. It's got normals. It's gray. It's got lines. Perfect. So now I would throw down another null and call this the T. So T. And again, I'm doing all caps just to make these easier to find later on. Lastly, I want to get that golf club, and it looks like the golf club, if I go back up to my transform, it looks like my golf club lost my subdivisions that I had on it, so I can just re-add those here, or I could bake them in on the cinema side, whatever works. So I'm going to go here, I'm going to hit my selection tool. It still has my select alembic paths highlighted, so I'm just going to click the club head and hit I'm going to hit the club head and hit the delete key, and you can see it deletes out. I'm actually not going to need the rest of this golf club pole to do any of this simulation since our camera is kind of locked off in this area. So I've got that. It inserts another blast. I'm just going to shake it off and move it over here, wire it back in, and then say delete non-selected. We get our golf club back. I'm going to convert it again, and when I do that, there we are. Our club comes through like so. I'm just gonna, and pardon my terrible modeling, I just needed to slap something together, so I kind of just did the best I could with this. It's not perfect, but it's just it gets the job done in terms of making some educational material. So I'll throw it on a subdivide, and this will get us a little bit closer back to where we were. I'm just going to give it a depth of 2 because that's sort of what I had in cinema. And now that I've got that, I'll just throw down a null for the club. Call that capital club. Nice. So we've got our ball, our T, and our club that we can all reference from some other nodes in Cinema 4D. So basically at this point, we are ready to go and start simulating stuff. One more thing from this section, the only other thing I would want when I'm setting up my simulation is to, I'm going to be doing some particles and some boundaries for volumes and stuff like that. And I really kind of want to know what's going to be viewed in camera. Well, if you look at if we go back to our alembic file up here and I choose my select alembic paths, you can't see the camera up here anywhere, and we actually exported the camera with our alembic file. So where is it? This is where I like to use the other version of importing geometry from a alembic file. So I'm going to go back here. I'm just going to select this this transform right here so I can kind of have some. It's just displaying the basic animation but scaled to our 0.1 that we chose. So I'm going to go up here. So we got that working. And I'm going to do the other way. So let's go File, Import, Alembic Scene. And here I can select my my Lesson 6 Golf Swing version 1.abc and hit Accept and hit Import. And you can see what happens is it dives us into our network here. If I go back up to the object level, you can see it's made this Alembic archive node for us. And if I pop out my tree view over here on the left, you can see under the object section, there's this lesson 6 golf swing VO1, and then we get actually a hierarchy that's very similar to what you would expect in in Cinema. But the way that translates over here into the network editor is if I dive inside, you can see that it's a subnet with all of these nodes connected. And then if I go into the club, you can see it's got the club and then the head and the pole and all that stuff. It's kind of built out the hierarchy this way. This is sort of how this translates over here. I personally find that this isn't I don't find this to be particularly user-friendly when I'm trying to set up and clean up my geometry. It seems it gets a little bit convoluted for me personally. If you can find a way to work with this node in any other ways, by all means, all power to you. But for me personally, I like being super explicit and breaking my stuff up into streams like this. But anyways, what I do find this particular import method to be useful for is getting the camera data. So basically, I'll just dive in here. I'll grab everything that I don't want to use. So basically this, and I'm just going to turn them off. And I've got my camera here. And you can see I dive in, and there is my camera from the other scene. Now, if I go to my camera viewer up here, or my camera picker up here rather, I can select that camera view, and you can see that I'm way far away from my grid. And that's because, again, we haven't scaled this the way we scaled our other geometry in here when we clicked on this transform. So I'm going to hit the U key to dive up, and over here, what I can do is scale this down. But this doesn't actually have anywhere on it a transform. There's no scale attribute up here. So I have to actually just parent this to a null. So I'm going to throw it on a null. And this null is just going to be used to scale this camera back into the right world space for our simulation. So I'm going to wire that in there. Again, that creates a parent-child relationship where the null is the parent and now the Alembic archive is the child. I'll go up to the null and type in 0.1. So now we're down on the right, we're down at the right level. And if I click play, looks like we can't see our Alembic import. I'm just going to go over here and I'm going to get this out of the way on the left. Looks like I'm not seeing the Alembic import. So I'm going to just hit spacebar F. And it looks like I'm not seeing this file at all anymore. Let's click that. Okay, that's there. Now it's scaled down. Yeah, it might have been like a GL error or something like that in our scene. I'm going to just turn off select. I'm just going to select, I'm going to click this little, it looks like a primitive with a circle around it. And if I unclick that, then the color coding should go away or not. 3D connect geometry. Maybe I'll select my manipulator. Okay. Now we're back in grayscale. That's cool. So now if I go to camera and I select my camera, you can see that my camera follows along with our animation like so. And I'm just going to click the real-time toggle. And maybe at this point, I'll also set my frame range back to 72 like it was over in, let's see, in Cinema, which we were going from 0 to 72. So actually what I would do is set my start frame to be 0 as well. So there we go. Now we're kind of one-to-one with what was going on in Cinema. Again, if you run into an issue with the camera doing something or something not showing up appropriately, you can actually trash your scene view and start over again. So one way I would do that is I would just go up here and click scene view like so, and then I can just close the other one. And it's sort of a way to just reset if any GL errors are happening. We hit play, and there we go. Cool. So now at this point, I'm basically ready to do all of my simulating and get all my sims done, and then I'll be ready to export them again. Now, that's how we can bring geometry out of Cinema 4D and into Houdini as an Alembic file, and really we kind of broke it out into its separate streams. And this is really sort of how we want to get camera data and geometry into Houdini. So in the next section, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how to get Alembic geometry out of Houdini and back into Cinema 4D. So stay tuned for that.